California may be known for its beaches and Hollywood dreams, but inside San Quentin State Prison, a much darker history was written. From the gas chamber to lethal injection, 13 men have been put to death since the state reinstated capital punishment. Today, we'll explore 10 of those executions holding great significance. The crimes that sealed their fate, the meals they chose before death, and the haunting last words they left behind. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more chilling stories from death row. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris's name is burned into California's history books, not only because of the crime he committed, but because he became the first person executed in the state in more than 25 years. His case reopened the gas chamber at San Quentin, and the way he left this world still sends shivers down the spine. Back in 1978, Harris was already living a life marked by violence and trouble. He had grown up in a broken home, shuffled between abusive environments, and found himself in and out of institutions from an early age. But the choices he made as an adult turned him from troubled man into a cold-blooded killer. On July 5, 1978, two teenage boys, 16-year-old John Mayeski and 15-year-old Michael Baker, went out in San Diego to enjoy a carefree day of fishing. They never came home. Harris and his younger brother abducted the boys, forcing them into their car. Harris wanted the vehicle to use in a bank robbery. Instead of letting the teens go, he drove them to a remote area and without mercy, shot both boys to death. Their lives were cut short for no reason other than Harris's greed and cruelty. Harris was captured quickly and sentenced to death. But what followed was more than a decade of legal battles. California had not carried out an execution since 1967, and Harris's case became the lightning rod for every challenge against the death penalty. By April 1992, after years of stays, appeals, and political debates, his date with the gas chamber finally arrived. On the night of his execution, Harris made his last meal request: a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a six-pack of Pepsi, and pizza from Domino's. It was a meal fit for indulgence, not reflection, and he consumed it without hesitation. In the early hours of April 21st, Harris was led into San Quentin's gas chamber. The room was silent, heavy with decades of controversy that had led to this moment. As cyanide pellets dropped and the fumes began to fill the chamber, Harris gave his final statement. His words were not of apology, nor were they of regret. Instead, he quoted a line from the 1991 film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." It was chilling, defiant, and unsettlingly casual, the words of a man who seemed more interested in being remembered than in showing remorse. Moments later, Robert Alton Harris was dead. His execution marked a turning point in California. For some, it was long-delayed justice. For others, it reopened old wounds about the morality of capital punishment. But no matter which side people stood on, Harris's final meal and his haunting last words guaranteed that his death would never be forgotten. But Harris would not be the last. The next prisoner wasn't a notorious first like Harris, but his crimes left Oakland shaken to its core. He didn't kill just once. He left behind a trail of death so brutal that even the gas chamber's cold steel seemed too merciful. David Mason. Only a year after Robert Alton Harris's death reopened California's gas chamber, another prisoner was led into that same steel chamber at San Quentin. His name was David Mason, and his crimes would shock even hardened detectives. In 1980, Oakland was rattled by a series of murders that left entire neighborhoods in fear. Mason had no single victim in mind. Instead, he drifted from one home to another, targeting the elderly and the vulnerable. Over the course of his spree, he killed 5 people, strangling some with his bare hands, suffocating others with pillows, and leaving scenes of terror behind him. These were not impulsive crimes. They were methodical, and they revealed a chilling lack of remorse. When police finally arrested Mason, they uncovered a man who admitted his crimes without hesitation. He even described in detail how he had ended each victim's life. For jurors, there was no doubt. Mason had to die, like Harris before him. His execution was delayed by years of appeals. By 1993, after more than a decade on death row, his time was up. Unlike many inmates who indulge in a final feast, Mason declined any special request. He ate only the standard prison meal, a decision that seemed to reflect a grim acceptance of his fate. In the early morning hours of August 24th, Mason was strapped into the gas chamber. Witnesses watched as the cyanide fumes rose, filling the air. His final words were quiet, almost startling in their sincerity. "I am deeply sorry for what I did. I hope my death brings closure." Moments later, Mason slumped forward, and the chamber fell silent. For his victims' families, it was the end of a nightmare. Yet California wasn't done writing headlines from San Quentin. The next execution would involve a man whose gruesome trail of bodies earned him a notorious title, one that still lingers on the lips of true crime historians: the Freeway Killer, William Bonin. By the mid-1990s, California's death chamber would see a new era. The gas chamber was fading into history, and for the first time, the state prepared to use lethal injection. The man chosen to mark this grim milestone was one of California's most infamous serial killers, William Bonin, the predator the media called the Freeway Killer. Bonin's crimes stretched across Southern California throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. He would cruise the highways in his van, picking up young men and teenage boys. Some were hitchhikers, others runaways, all vulnerable and alone. What followed was unthinkable. Bonin tortured, raped, and murdered at least 14 known victims, though authorities believe the real number was even higher. Their bodies were discarded along freeways like trash, sparking a wave of fear across the state. Bonin's capture revealed a man who showed little remorse. He even bragged to fellow inmates about his crimes, speaking with a cold detachment that horrified anyone who heard him. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to death in 1983, beginning a 13-year wait for his execution. On February 23, 1996, Bonin was led into San Quentin's execution chamber. Unlike David Mason, who had declined a special meal, Bonin indulged heavily. His last request included 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 servings of chocolate ice cream, and multiple Cokes. He ate like a man unconcerned with what awaited him. At 12:09 a.m., the lethal injection process began. Witnesses watched as the drugs entered his veins. Bonin's final words were astonishingly casual for a man responsible for so much horror. "That's it." And with that, the Freeway Killer was gone. His death closed a dark chapter, but California's execution chamber would not remain quiet. Just months later, another condemned man would take the same walk. Not a serial killer, but someone whose crime was no less brutal and whose last words carried a very different weight. Keith Daniel Williams. Just 10 weeks after the Freeway Killer's execution, San Quentin prepared once again for another life to end. This time, it wasn't a notorious serial predator, but a man whose single act of violence during a robbery left behind a trail of grief that lasted nearly 2 decades. His name was Keith Daniel Williams. In 1979, Williams entered a Sacramento convenience store with robbery on his mind. But things escalated quickly. In the course of the crime, he shot and killed a woman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unlike William Bonin, who preyed on dozens, Williams's case revolved around one victim, but the pain for her family was immeasurable. For years, the justice system debated his fate. Appeals were filed, legal challenges mounted, but in the end, the verdict stood. Williams would be put to death. On May 3, 1996, he was escorted into the lethal injection chamber. Unlike some prisoners who make extravagant requests for a last meal, Williams asked for nothing beyond the standard prison fare. It was a quiet acceptance of what was to come. As the execution began, Williams turned to face the victim's family. His final words were not defiant, nor were they cryptic. Instead, they carried the weight of remorse, an apology for the life he had taken and the years of sorrow he had caused. Moments later, the drugs did their work, and Keith Daniel Williams was gone. San Quentin would not rest for long. Only 2 years later, another man would be strapped to the gurney, a case far more controversial. Unlike Williams, this condemned prisoner insisted he was innocent until the very end, and his last words would reflect that unshakable claim: Thomas Martin Thompson. By the summer of 1998, San Quentin's death chamber had become a grimly familiar stage. Yet when Thomas Martin Thompson's turn came, It carried an intensity all its own. His case had divided lawyers, activists, and even some members of the public because of one haunting question: was the wrong man about to die? Thompson's story began in 1981 when 20-year-old Ginger Fleischle was found raped and murdered. The crime shocked her community and quickly drew police suspicion toward Thompson, who had been her roommate's ex-boyfriend. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture. Thompson had assaulted Ginger, killed her, and disposed of her body. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but it was enough to convince the jury. In 1983, he was sentenced to death. As the years passed, doubts grew. Legal scholars and defense attorneys argued that another man, a friend of Thompson's, may have been the real killer. Even some federal judges admitted the case was troubling, but the courts upheld the conviction. Thompson never stopped insisting that he was innocent. On July 14, 1998, he was led into the execution chamber. Before his death, Thompson requested a last meal of 4 burritos, 4 tacos, French fries, and ice cream, a spread that felt almost festive, even as the shadow of the gurney loomed. When asked for his final words, Thompson did not beg, threaten, or lash out. He looked at the witnesses and said firmly, "For the record, I'm innocent." With those words, the drugs entered his veins, and California carried out one of its most debated executions. For some, it was justice finally delivered. For others, it was a miscarriage of justice that could never be undone. And yet, while the controversy of Thompson's execution lingered, the next man to face death at San Quentin would bring a very different tone. His crime was brutal, but his final hours revealed a softer side, and a last request that was strikingly simple. Jaturun Siripongs, on February 9, 1999, the quiet halls of San Quentin prepared for the execution of a man whose case drew international attention. His name was Jaturun Siripongs, a Thai national convicted of a double murder during a 1981 robbery in Garden Grove, California. According to prosecutors, Siripongs had entered a store intending to steal. Inside, he killed 2 employees, one of them bound, the other stabbed. The brutality of the crime shocked Orange County. Siripongs admitted his role in the robbery, but always denied committing the murders. He claimed an accomplice, never identified, was responsible for the killings. That claim fueled debate for years, but the courts held firm. The evidence pointed back to him. What made Siripongs' case different was the wave of support he received in his final years. The Thai government, human rights groups, and even Catholic leaders pleaded for clemency, describing him as a man who had found deep religious faith while in prison. But in the end, the pleas fell short. California refused to halt the execution. When asked for his last meal, Siripongs kept it simple: fresh fruit and yogurt. There was no indulgence, no extravagance, just a light plate for a man who seemed at peace with his fate. In his final moments, strapped to the gurney, he turned toward the witnesses and offered what many remembered as a deeply human apology. He asked forgiveness from the victims' families, his words soft but sincere. Moments later, the lethal drugs flowed, ending his life. The debate over his guilt lingered, but what struck many was how calm and humble he seemed in his final hours. Siripongs left behind a sense of mystery, a man many believed may not have told the whole story. And then came the next execution, just months later. This time, the condemned man's background as a war veteran made his case especially haunting, and his final act, a simple dessert, would leave an unsettling image that still lingers. Manuel Babbitt. Just 3 months after Jaturun Siripongs' execution, San Quentin prepared once again. This time, the condemned man was Manuel Babbitt, a Vietnam War veteran whose story stirred one of the most emotional public debates California had ever seen over the death penalty. Babbitt's life had been shaped by trauma long before he ever faced a courtroom. As a young soldier, he was sent into the thick of combat in Vietnam, where he witnessed unspeakable violence. Like many veterans, he returned home with deep psychological scars. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, it often went untreated. In 1980, Babbitt broke into the Sacramento home of 78-year-old Leah Shendell. During the burglary, he brutally beat her, and she later died of her injuries. For prosecutors, the crime was simple. An elderly woman had been murdered in her own home. For supporters, it was more complicated. They argued that Babbitt's actions were rooted in untreated PTSD and that executing him would be punishing a broken soldier who had already sacrificed for his country. The appeal stretched on for nearly 2 decades, but ultimately, the courts and the governor rejected clemency. His fate was sealed. On May 4, 1999, Babbitt faced his last meal. He asked only for ice cream, a stark, almost childlike request that struck many as heartbreaking given the weight of his story. Strapped to the gurney, Babbitt's final words reflected a man who had found peace. He spoke softly, "I forgive you all. I hope you forgive me." Moments later, the injection flowed, and Manuel Babbitt was gone. For some, it was justice for Leah Schendel's family. For others, it was a tragedy. The state had executed a war veteran whose country had failed him first, and yet the cycle continued. Less than a year later, another killer was brought into the chamber. His crimes stretched back to the late 1970s, and his death would bring an end to a wave of terror that had haunted California for decades. Darrell Keith Rich. By the spring of 2000, California's execution chamber had seen men with very different stories. Some defiant, others remorseful, some even insisting on innocence. But when Darrell Keith Rich was led to the gurney, there was no question about his guilt. His crimes had left behind one of the darkest legacies in Northern California's history. In the summer of 1978, Rich unleashed a wave of violence in Shasta County. Over just a few months, he raped and murdered 4 women and girls, ranging in age from 11 to 27. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned investigators. He bludgeoned, shot, and strangled his victims, discarding their bodies in remote areas as if they were nothing. Authorities believe there may have been even more victims, but the 4 murders alone were enough to earn him the title of one of California's most dangerous predators. His arrest brought a measure of relief to terrified communities, and his trial ended in a death sentence. Still, Rich spent more than 2 decades on death row before his execution date was finally set. On March 15, 2000, he made no last meal request. Unlike others who indulged in comfort foods or extravagant spreads, Rich chose nothing beyond the standard prison fare. Perhaps it was indifference, perhaps resignation, but it matched the quiet way he faced his last hours. When asked for his final words, Rich did not offer excuses or denial. Instead, he spoke words that were simple but heavy. "I am sorry. I hope you find peace." With that, the lethal drugs entered his body, and California closed the book on one of its most terrifying crime sprees. Yet, as the state moved into the new millennium, another execution was waiting. This time, it wasn't a serial predator, but a man who had once been spared death, only to find himself back on the gurney years later. Robert Lee Massie. Few names on California's death row carried as many twists and turns as Robert Lee Massie. His journey through the justice system spanned more than 2 decades, filled with second chances, reversals, and finally, an ending that seemed almost inevitable. Massie's crimes began long before his final one. In 1965, he shot and killed a man during a robbery, earning him a death sentence. But in 1972, when the U.S. Supreme Court temporarily struck down the death penalty nationwide, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. He had been spared. What followed was a chance at redemption, and he squandered it. In 1978, Massie was paroled. Less than a year later, he walked into a San Francisco liquor store to commit another robbery. Inside was 29-year-old businessman Boris Naumov. During the holdup, Massie shot and killed him. California quickly placed him back on death row, this time with little hope of escape. His appeals dragged on for more than 20 years, but in the end, the outcome never changed. On March 27, 2001, Massie sat down for his final meal, a plate of spaghetti with meatballs, a fresh salad, and garlic bread. It was a simple Italian dinner for a man who had run out of time. When the curtain rose inside the execution chamber, Massie looked toward the witnesses. His last words were brief, spoken in a soft, almost weary voice: "Forgive me." With the injection complete, the long, winding saga of Robert Lee Massie came to an end. The chamber would open again the following year, this time for a killer whose final act before death wasn't words of denial or apology, but something far more unusual: the recitation of a poem he had written himself. Stephen Wayne Anderson. On a cold January night in 2002, San Quentin prepared for the execution of Stephen Wayne Anderson, a man whose life had spiraled into violence long before the crime that sealed his fate. Anderson's past was a dark one. Before the murder that brought him to California's death row, he had already taken lives in New Mexico, including that of a fellow inmate during a prison escape. He was a drifter, a career criminal, who seemed to leave destruction in his path wherever he went. But his final crime in 1980 would shock the small community of Bloomington, California. That night, Anderson broke into the home of 81-year-old Elizabeth Lyman, an elderly woman who lived alone. He expected money or valuables. Instead, when she startled him during the burglary, Anderson pulled out a gun and shot her dead. It was a senseless killing, one that robbed a community of a beloved neighbor and forever branded him as a cold-blooded murderer. At trial, prosecutors painted Anderson as ruthless, and the jury agreed. He was sentenced to death. For more than 2 decades, he fought through appeals, but none could change the outcome. When his final day arrived on January 29, 2002, Anderson's last meal was as eclectic as it was memorable. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, a pint of cottage cheese, a serving of hominy, a slice of peach pie, and a scoop of chocolate chip ice cream. A mixture of comfort foods, sweet and savory, as though he were clinging to the simplest pleasures before the end. As the curtain rose in the chamber, Anderson did something unusual. Instead of a statement of remorse or defiance, he recited a poem he had written himself. A final reflection in verse, his words echoing into the silent room. Witnesses recalled it as haunting, a strange attempt to leave behind art in the place where his life would end. Moments later, the drugs flowed, and Stephen Wayne Anderson was pronounced dead. His execution marked the 10th carried out since California reinstated the death penalty, each case different, each story unsettling. And while the gurney at San Quentin would see more men in the years ahead, these final words and final meals remain frozen in time, echoes from prisoners who faced justice in the starkest possible way. If you found these stories compelling, subscribe for more true crime content. Drop a comment sharing which last words or last meal struck you the most. And don't forget to like this video to support the channel.